Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the latest show here on DZRJ. I'm attorney Sarah Jane Sugitan, and you're on Piracy Watch. Joining me this morning is Mr. Harry Tambuatco, CEO of Superbrands, to talk about certification marks and why intellectual property is important in our daily lives. Good morning, Mr. Harry
Hi,
Tambuatco.
attorney. Sarap
Hi.
naman sa RJAM. Last week, guest tayo. Ngayon, may show ka na. Okay,
Yes, yes, definitely. We thank DZRJ for giving the Intellectual Property Office this airtime to talk about intellectual property rights, which a lot of people need to know about because we create it on a daily basis.
Yeah, it's interesting how businessmen and alam mo, the bigger number of entrepreneurs in the country are SMEs and even micro SMEs.
Yes, it's right.
Yeah, and what's interesting is many of them are ignorant of the fact that the only way that they can protect these names that they work under and create as goodwill, they no longer really own it. If only they knew, di ba, attorney?
Yes, actually, when we create names or brands for our stores or products, the only way to own it is through registration with a government agency called the Intellectual Property Office. The problem is not many people know about it, and the IP office itself is based in Makati instead of having nationwide offices.
Attorney Sarah, why is it the ignorance of the entrepreneurs is so it's terrible. I mean, people think that should they register their trade names in the business with the Department of Trade and Industry, no, or even if you do partnership in corporations with the Security and Exchange, they think okay na tama na yun, not realizing the ignorance is alam mo, it's not excusable. For example, you create a name over the years, kumita ka na, umaandar ka na, may goodwill ka na, be it a restaurant, a service company, supply store. And then all of a sudden you realize somebody comes to you and says, alam mo, hindi yun yan, you have to take down your signboard, palitan mo lahat. Well, hindi lang malaking abala na wala pa yung goodwill na tinayo mo.
Yes.
Now, it's amazing, why is it people don't know about intellectual property? Ako, I ask you, you're with the office. Why is that? Why is there kulang sa awareness, no?
It's well, first of all, trademark registration for brands and logos, especially for businessmen, is not mandatory. Unlike business name registration, now you have to go through in order to operate as a business in a specific locality. Second of all, intellectual property awareness here in the country seems to be more communal. Instead of people owning a certain brand or a song or a creation of the mind, people tend to share it right away, not knowing that these are personal property rights that you have to register first in order to protect yourself and in order for you to own it. Well, this is a different species of property, unlike real properties like lands or personal property like cars. Intellectual property, first of all, has to be registered in order for you to own it and in order for you to enforce and exercise dominion over that particular right.
For those who are in the know and those that read, no, basically, if we were to look at the last 5 decades in our history, our economic history in Southeast Asia, when about 40, 50 years ago, 5 decades ago, it was first Japan. They were the manufacturers of the world. And I remember when I was much younger, it was all about, pag sinabi mo made in Japan, pangit yan. When they started to brand and they started to widen their profits, their brand or their title, their image moved, it changed. Made in Japan now became very popular and high quality because of simply branding. Now, that moved to Taiwan. I keep saying this example because it bothers me that many businessmen today don't still understand it, especially those of my age. When it moved to Taiwan, Taiwan did the same thing it didn't take them a decade, it was only 8 years. And then from Taiwan, it went to South Korea. I remember when we could buy the cheapest rubber shoes and shirts and whatnot in South Korea. And then look what happened to South Korea. They started branding with big names today. In fact, it is not enough these corporate trade names became the brand images. Not necessarily the flag of South Korea, but the country South Korea started branding with the likes of Samsung, LG, and the bigger brands that South Korea has created. Now it's China, and China is slowly branding. Here in the Philippines, we see the cars Cherry and whatnot. They're now beginning to brand. Now, what I don't understand is people still claim ignorance to what is called branding. I represent super brands internationally. And para sa amin, branding we've required now, I've made it a requirement for every brand entry into our program that you have to be registered. And should you need help, the IP office they're always willing to help and assist everybody. I just understand why there's still this ignorance. It's almost stupid.
Yes, in fact, with trademark registration, you don't actually need a lawyer in order to own your brand. All you have to do is fill out a form and pay the filing fees with the Intellectual Property Office, which doesn't cost much. It's around 1,000, between 1,000 and 3,000.
Biro mo, mura lang, oh, tapos hindi pa rin sila nagre-rehistro.
And then, although there is a waiting period of 6 months before a trademark certificate of registration is released, due to the fact that the application has to be examined based on the existing database, whether or not you have a similar name that's previously registered. So there's the fact that you have to calculate, you have to take into consideration that your brand may or may not be registered. It might actually be rejected.
Well, you don't create a brand anyway overnight. The business registration will allow you the immediate opportunity to trade, to set up warehousing, inventory, if not product manufacturing, distribution, and basically the store if you're going to go into actual retail. Surely that's 6 months if that's the given period. You don't say overnight, oh, itong produkto ko, itong brand name title ko. It has to be well thought of, and products that are created just like that will tend to fall anyway. In super brands, one of my regular popular speeches I keep saying is there's 25,000 brand entries in the market every year. How will he be able to identify specific products if the brands don't necessarily stand out? Now, how brands make it and sustain themselves in the market has a lot to do, not necessarily with longevity, but with a brand promise that they've created. Of course, their distribution network to make sure it's available, their basic promotions, etc., etc., etc. But you see, even with a 6 months waiting period, it's still ample time. Pwede pa rin. For example, the Hari Corporation is the business entity, but the brand is X, Y, and Z. The X, Y, and Z should be treated as a brand. I mean, as a tangible product, even though sometimes imagined in this case. Diba, it could be a service, so it's not necessarily a person, a car, or a tangible product. But you see, as you generate those brands, pwede naman, you know.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Harry Tambuatco. We will be pausing for a short break. Please stay with us. Good morning. Welcome back to Piracy Watch. And you're with me, Attorney Sarah Jane Sugitan. Joining us this morning is Mr. Harry Tambuatco from Super Brands, and we're talking about the importance of trademark registration as a form of intellectual property. Now, so Harry,
Yes, attorney.
Certification marks are an example of trademarks. And trademarks have to be registered with the Intellectual Property Office. Is your certification mark registered with us?
Well, that's the funny part, considering we are a multinational and our logo is very prominent all over the world. You see, Super Brands is in 88 countries worldwide. We've been in the Philippines now 16 years, going on 17. And we have what we call volumes that we identify as a program, a 2-year program. We're now on volume 7. We're entering volume 7 in 2011. Interestingly enough, we were registered under a different trade name initially called Super Brands Limited, but this is...
That's registered with the SEC
yes,
and the DTI.
And the DTI, yes. It wasn't initially with intellectual property, but intellectual property, the registration was worldwide, or in most countries, like all over Southeast Asia, because 9 out of the 11 countries in Southeast Asia, we were registered. Interestingly enough, we weren't in the Philippines, which is how I got to know all about IP, and I became a personal advocacy, because I didn't realize how many businessmen are tripping over
the
this.
certification mark that your company has is a seal.
Yes, it's
which,
a seal.
Like any other certification mark, means that a product or standard has complied with certain qualifications in order for it to garner that certification.
Para hindi makopya ng iba. So iba pala yun, ano, attorney? Trademark, iba sa trade name.
It's
Iba pa
definitely
yon.
different. Trade name is what you use to operate to get a business registration with the DTI.
With the
See, the problem is
DTI.
there are three separate entities that are involved when you do business. There's,
Right.
of course, there's the DTI for business name registration.
Department of Trade and Industry.
Yes,
Right.
there's the Securities and Exchange Commission for the corporate name.
For partnership
You are
and corporation.
Partnerships and corporations.
So entrepreneurs, DTI. Partnerships and corporations,
no, all
SEC
businesses
na.
have to get DTI registration in order to
Okay.
operate. However, as I mentioned earlier, trademark registration is not mandatory. See, trademarks are what you use for products and services. It doesn't necessarily point to the person or the entity behind the brand.
But shouldn't it be? For example, I have a shoe store and I import the shoes. Let's say 50% of my inventory that I sell is imported, and the other 50% will be locally made. Now, for example, SM. SM was basically a trader, it was basically a retailer. But over the years, SM, because of its success, has become a trademark. And that's basically their intellectual property. Pag sinabi mo SM, everybody knows it's not necessarily shoes. It's really the malls nowadays. And their business trade name, and they call it if I'm not mistaken, they have the SM department stores, and then they also have the SM malls. Of course, they've expanded to real estate, banking, etc., etc. But the SM over the years became the trade name because of their success. So imagine if they did not register the letters SM, di sayang, di ba? Hindi nila magamit. That can, I remember long ago, somebody registered here the name. I was involved in this specific example of Hard Rock Cafe. Kasi nauna dito along MH Del Pilar, no, on Mabini, may nagtayo dyan na Hard Rock Cafe. The three words, the three letters, the letters that made the words. And finally, Ong Beng Seng, the person who owned the franchise in Southeast Asia and Australia, decided to expand to the Philippines. So when he came, the problem was...
It was already operating.
Oo, may nag-ooperate na
Someone
iba.
else was operating.
But what we did was we went straight to the owners and we bought the trade name para hindi na magkaso. There was
So you settled it.
we settled. There was mediation, arbitration between us and the private side, and we were able to get the name back. They then turned around and opened 10 years after. I remember that was the name of the operation then. But the funny part is, what happens if like SM did not register and they created all this goodwill, and then I'll put up a store right beside them and I'll say I'm SM and I'm registered and I'm a small sari-sari store right beside them. I will become a real nuisance to them. Harassment lang yan, di ba?
Yes, and the thing with our system is that it's first to file.
First to file.
The brand owner who is first to file will have the rights over that particular mark, regardless of the bigger owner who has established goodwill and forgot to register. Anyway, we'll pause for a traffic and weather update from Charlie of traffic.com. Welcome back on Piracy Watch with me, attorney Sarah Jane Sugitan. Now, before the break, we were talking about how businessmen tend to register for DTI, business name registration, and corporate name with the SEC, and not the Intellectual Property Office of the Philippines for the brands that they use for their products or services. Now, for those who are not yet in the know, the Intellectual Property Office of the Philippines is a government agency under the DTI that accepts registration for trademarks for your brands and logos, and also for patents or inventions. The IPO Phil is located on 351 Hill Puyat Avenue, Makati, and has satellite offices all over the country. For more information about the IPO, do check out their website, www.ipophil.gov.ph. Now, going back to our topic, Mr. Harry Tambuatco here with me. Before we pause for the break, we're talking about how business owners are not aware of trademark registration, and yet when people start copying their brands or competition starts eating up their market, that's when they realize that they are not protected. They don't have trademark registration and cannot sue, basically because they do not own the intellectual property over that particular brand.
Attorney, before we go on, because I was listening to the news that you put on right before in the traffic report, I'd just like to mimic. Ladies and gentlemen, the traffic report. We have traffic. Hindi naman na iba. And now for the weather. Ladies and gentlemen, it is hot or it's wet. Ganun lang naman sa Pilipinas. But yes,